G'day and welcome back to another DBZ Dokkan Battle video. In this video, we are going to take a look at the game mode mechanic of giant forms. Now, giant forms are a mechanic that can be triggered either via the passive or can be triggered via the active skill. Giant forms are essentially multiple turns of basically vulnerability or invulnerability. So the giant forms firstly can only be activated once per battle unless stated. Giant forms also last from a range of 2 to 3 turns traditionally. If a giant form lasts longer than 2 to 3 turns, it will be stated that it will only be for 1 turn. Now, giant forms can be activated via passive or active transformation. These are the exact same thing. So if you use an active skill or you have the passive proc, which can occur from other units, then that giant form will last 2 to 3 turns. But it can occur that giant forms can last less than 2 turns. Giant forms can last less than 2 turns in the situation whereby you defeat an enemy and the phase changes. So let's say, for example, you are facing Strength Goku in the Fighting Legend Goku event, and you defeat Goku with a giant form. That giant form, even if it's in its first turn, will definitely end the next turn as the phase changes. Now there's a couple things to understand about giant forms. Firstly, previously giant forms did not have any key in their giant form states. They cannot share links in their giant form states. Giant forms do not have the ability to benefit from support items or from support effects. So even if you have a 2-turn support effect, it will not affect the giant form. Giant forms do not take any damage at all. They have no defense, but they take no damage. The damage stat is calculated, but they take none of it. It is nullified. And then the final thing about giant forms is that they pause the turn count. So for example, if your giant form is activated on turn 6 and it takes 3 turns or 4 turns if you have good old Tapion, which we'll talk about now, then essentially what happens is you basically end your giant form on turn 6, which is the big mechanic of giant forms. The invulnerability exists outside of basically anything that's happened. So if I have a Whis, if I've just activated a Whis, I can still activate my giant form, use it for 3 turns, and then the Whis will still be active when I come back, which is a pretty important facility. A lot of giant forms now have a key added into them, but giant forms have set stats. So you'll see there that they have a set attack stat, and this has a set multiplier from the leader skill. There's no other multipliers that apply to their super attacks as well. So you get a set attack stat as well with your giant forms, unless they raise attack on giant form or something specific that's stated in their passive. They have a flat attack stat. So giant forms are pretty interesting from that regard. I think a big thing with giant forms that makes them so interesting is a lot of the times I don't think players enjoy them. They kind of break up your team's flow, but with the changes that they made, with the turns pausing, with all of these things, giant forms are actually incredibly useful, especially the active skill giant forms. Active skill giant forms can be used not only to trigger important bits of damage, but actually the most important part of an active giant form is the ability to change the opponent's turn structure. So let's take an example. Let's say you are facing Zamasu, and Zamasu has a whole bunch of AoEs lined up. Now I could take these AoEs, or I could activate Piccolo's giant form and run Zamasu through 2 or 3 rotations, and Zamasu himself will eventually change his attack patterns. And this gives you the opportunity to possibly prevent any poor rotations taking a poor set array of attacks. Now it can also work in the opposite direction, of course, but generally speaking, giant forms have that added benefit. It allows you to essentially protect the rotation whilst changing the boss's attack pattern. So it allows you to potentially turn an unfavorable attack array into a pretty favorable one. This is just a great example of the turn choice. You can see at the bottom here that we are at turn 6, and when we end the turn, we'll be at turn 6 as well. So it's a very, very normal mechanic. The only important thing to understand here when it comes to giant forms is that any active skills you proc before the giant form is procced, especially if it's an active skill giant form, will still count, but not the orb changing effects. So let's say, for example, you have a unit that just transformed, like Golden Frieza, transforming Frieza, who just transformed, and he now has his guaranteed crit. If you enter the giant form state, he will retain his guaranteed crit. However, you will unfortunately lose any of his orb changing effects. So, because obviously you still use orbs for your giant forms to consume. So, it's pretty interesting. I think overall, giant forms can be an incredibly useful mechanic when utilized properly. The important things that you need to know about it are that they pause the turn counter, they take no damage, they have a set attack stat, and they are not benefited from any support items. They are benefited by gear on your characters, and obviously dupes, and your stat arrays do affect the units, but that's it. Giant forms will last 2 to 3 turns unless stated, and Tapion, who is the only lead in the history of the game, has the ability to, well, not the only lead, but the best giant form lead ever still, has the ability to extend your giant form's maximum number of turns by 1. Now he extends the max, which means having 2 Tapions means your giant forms can essentially last up to 5 turns, which is a very long time, but also is a very long time of guaranteed damage. And that's basically it from me. I hope this has assisted you in understanding how giant forms work, and I hope it's been able to help you guys out in establishing that. Bye.